All right, so I chose to do the bike share on the Santander bicycles in London because I spent a year abroad last year studying there, and I used them a couple of times. Let me just get this out of the way. Okay, so this is my question that I'm trying to answer through my study of this data set: is should Santander provide more bikes and docks at certain times of the day? And I ran into some interesting insights, which I'll get to. But my answer would be I don't think that there need to be any more bikes, and there will definitely need to be more docks and possibly more stations, especially in key, specifically commuter areas or key tourist areas. So here was my data set. It was fairly limited compared to some of the other bike share ones. The bottom three rows are the columns that I added myself to see the trip duration and kind of narrow down the timestamp that I got for the start to specific hours and specific days. So the first part of my analysis involved figuring out, I wanted to figure out which ones were the most popular stations, where the most trips were happening, both for stations where people were starting their trip and ending their trip. And there was a significant amount of overlap. So I chose to work with these four stations that overlapped for popular stations to commute from and popular stations to commute to. So here's just a histogram of these four stations just for across 2019 for starting your trip. And you can see that at stations like Waterloo and Belgrove, it's pretty high on the AMs when people are coming into the city off of like Tube or off of the rail system and then hopping on bikes. And for Hyde Park, this is a popular tourist destination in London. You can see there's a much wider dispersion. Yes, and here I also narrowed down these specific locations by their busiest day. So I found which day for these locations were people taking the most trips out of any other day in 2019. And I found something interesting. Now, you might be looking at this and thinking, how in the world could a bike station here accommodate like over 160 trips in 1 hour? Because if you worked with any of these data sets, you would know that bike stations generally have maybe between 20 to 50 docks. So I looked at this and thought, wow, that's really interesting. I don't know how you could be taking that many trips, that many bikes from a station when the station is not refilling. As you can see on the end graph here, it's not refilling until much later in the day. And I found that this was the case for all the locations that I looked at. As you can see here in Belgrove, it's the same thing. And in Hyde Park, it might be hard to tell from the graphs, but it takes a while for them to fill back up for those stations to fill up with bikes. So I decided to take a focus in and just do Hyde Park Corner as a tourist destination and Waterloo Station 3 as a commuter station. And so I looked at it from the busiest day, like I showed you, and then also from a random day, which I actually chose this today, but a year ago. So I guess it's not entirely random, but either way, I wanted to get two perspectives. And then I wanted to know, were these stations facing unusual fluxes of trips? Is there some kind of error in how this data was collected? So I ran, what I did here was looked at kind of over time in 4-hour intervals. The red line represents the dock capacity. So that's how many docks there are at that station, and the blue line represents how many bikes are being subtracted from or added to that station over time. And as you can see, there's a peak from 11 to 12 at Hyde Park, kind of in the early to late morning. But according to this, they're actually negative bikes. Like people are taking too many trips for the bikes that actually fit into the dock station. So there's normally supposed to be, I think, 36 in Hyde Park, and they're taking 135 more bikes than there are offered, according to the data that I was given, which I think is an error. And as you can see as well, they're depositing more bikes after 8 p.m. or up to 8 p.m., they're depositing more bikes than there are docks in this station. And it was the same thing at Hyde Park on August 4th as well in 2019. And so I looked at Waterloo Station as well, and it's an even bigger jump here. In the morning at Waterloo Station on its busiest day, there was a deficit of 350 bikes, which means in my data set, I was shown that there were 350 trips that had been taken from 5 to 9 on this busiest day, but there are only 29 bikes at this Waterloo Station. So my conclusions are there might be something wrong with this data set in terms of how the recorder of the data set is actually logging what it means to dock a bike. And I looked around at this on the website. Perhaps you can dock a bike at a location without putting it into the dock. You could put on your phone that you've docked it near the station. Maybe there's a geolocator so you're able to lock the bike and terminate your charge. So maybe that's why people are leaving just a surplus of bikes near the station and not actually in the docks. But if this is gauging the correct volume of users, if that is the case, then more docks should be built in these stations. And for areas like Waterloo Station, there should definitely be more stations added near that area. As was shown, there was a deficit of 350 bikes at that station. So if Santander wants actual docks at their stations to keep the bikes secure, then they need to put in more stations, more docks at those highly trafficked areas. And that concludes the presentation.
Thank you, Nathan. Questions for Nathan?
I'm just interested in how long you kind of spun in circles when you saw that the data was kind of strange.
Yeah, I actually did a little bit more exploring to try and figure out. I thought maybe they were duplicates. I mean, I checked for duplicates at the beginning of the process, but there weren't. I also checked to see if there were. Oh, sorry, my video. I also checked to see if my bike, if there were duplicate bike IDs, like if somehow it was making an error and accidentally processing that like the same bike was checked out a bunch of times but under a different rental ID. And I found that wasn't the case. There were a couple bikes that had left the same station twice in a day, but when I looked at where they started and ended, they were bikes that had been rented and then returned to the same station, and then later in the day taken on a trip. So I really don't know. I think it would have to be I would really have to talk to the people who work with Santander bikes to know more about whether or not you're actually able to drop off a bike without properly putting it into a dock. Yeah, that's the only conclusion I came to.
I mean, I just to like make it clear, I lived in Boston, and there is a system called Lime Bikes, and they do have the ability to not. They do have either docking or not docking options.
Yeah, and when I lived in London, I always put my bike back in the dock. Like I don't remember seeing Santander bikes outside of their docks. I remember using Mobike for that kind of thing. But maybe I just don't remember. I don't know.
Nathan, in New York City, like a Union Square and some other stations, they actually have like attendants that gather the bikes. So maybe London does that too. With like they have like literally like 50 or 100 bikes like strung together, and you just hand it to them. Yeah,
I was curious. I'll say one more thing quickly. When I looked on the website, the procedure when you can't fit a bike into a station is that they give you an extra 15 minutes for free, and they direct you to go to a different station. That's what's in the documents, which makes me think that it's supposed to go into a dock if the procedure is to route you to go to another nearby station to dock your bike, which makes this more confusing. So I don't know.
Okay, thank you very much, Nathan. That's really great insight.